In this short video, I'm going to break down how to manipulate variables in Articulate Storyline using JavaScript. Though it's really easy to work with variables using triggers, sometimes you need to perform more complex operations with variables that might be time-consuming or even impossible to achieve just using triggers. Manipulating variables using JavaScript is an easy way to perform very complex operations with variables in just a few steps. In this example, I'll be using JavaScript to manipulate the value of one variable, resting energy expenditure, or REE, based on the value of another variable, fat-free mass. Resting energy expenditure is the energy your body expends to fuel basic metabolic functions. The amount of energy that an individual expends at rest is primarily a function of their amount of fat-free mass, because fat-free mass contains the metabolically active tissues in the body. If we were creating a module on human metabolism, then perhaps we might want to include an activity where learners can better understand this relationship by seeing how resting energy expenditure changes as a function of fat-free mass, which they can control using this slider here. If we want to dynamically display changes in resting energy expenditure based on changes a learner makes to the variable for fat-free mass using this slider, then our variable for resting energy expenditure needs to be dynamically updated based on our variable for fat-free mass. However, the relationship between fat-free mass and resting energy expenditure is not simply one-to-one. Rather, scientists have estimated that it follows this equation here. Resting energy expenditure in kilojoules is equal to 1,264 plus 93.4 times fat-free mass in kilograms. Using JavaScript makes it easy to relate these two variables based on this equation. So to manipulate variables using JavaScript, first you need to add a trigger to execute a chunk of JavaScript code. I've included two triggers that execute the same chunk of code, one that runs when the timeline starts, and another when the variable for fat-free mass changes. This way, resting energy expenditure will be calculated at the beginning of the timeline, based on the initial or saved value for fat-free mass, and then will be recalculated every time a learner moves the slider and updates our variable for fat-free mass. So let's take a look at this JavaScript code. The code for manipulating variables is very simple and can be broken down into 4 sections. The first section is one line and essentially creates a bridge between Storyline and JavaScript. This allows us to retrieve variables for Storyline, work with them using JavaScript, and then return them to Storyline. The second section involves retrieving Storyline variables and defining them as JavaScript variables. You should retrieve any variables that you plan to use or manipulate. For this example, I'm retrieving the variables fat-free mass and REE, or resting energy expenditure, from Storyline. The third section involves performing operations using these variables. On the first line here, I'm converting the current value of fat-free mass from pounds into kilograms, because those are the units that need to be plugged into the equation to calculate resting energy expenditure. On the second line, I'm using the equation presented earlier to calculate resting energy expenditure, based on the current value of fat-free mass in kilograms. On the third line, I'm converting resting energy expenditure from kilojoules into kilocalories, because those are the units that I'd like the variable to be displayed in on the slide. And on the fourth line, here, I'm rounding off the current value of resting energy expenditure so it doesn't contain an ugly number of decimal places. Rather, it's a whole integer. Finally, the fourth section of this chunk of code involves returning variables to Storyline by linking the JavaScript variable with the corresponding Storyline variable. Okay, so if we close that, and when this project is published, as you can see, the JavaScript code is executed whenever I move the slider for fat-free mass exactly as we wanted. And this is how you manipulate variables in Articulate Storyline 360 using JavaScript.